right, if you have a Bible, why don't you go ahead and open up to Hebrews chapter 12. We're working our way through this study, started it towards the beginning of this year, and so we were actually making pretty good time, moving pretty quick through Hebrews, getting close to the end. There's only 13 chapters, so we'll finish it up here in the next few weeks, but this is a great text coming right out of Hebrews chapter 11, the Hall of Faith, the Hall of Fame in the Bible, so to speak. And I want to just begin tonight by asking you the question, and you can answer this back if you feel comfortable. What do you consider the most valuable thing in your life? You can give me church answers, that's okay. All right, your salvation? What was it? God's love? What else? Most valuable thing in your life? Okay, family? Health? What would you say is your most valuable personal quality? That one gets a little more intimate, doesn't it? What's your most valuable personal quality? If you had to answer fill in the end of this sentence, this is the most important thing that I possess, what would it be? Personally. That's a good question to think about. I'd be interested to see you guys answer that, all of you answer that. But I think according to the writer of Hebrews, the most valuable thing he would say in anyone's life is faith. It's faith. We just come out of this whole chapter where he has said, by faith, Moses, by faith, Abraham, by faith, Sarah, by faith, Jacob, by faith, Isaac, by faith, Rahab, by faith. Every one of these characters that he introduced us to in chapter 11, he was focusing on this personal quality that they possessed, which was their faith. And faith is the belief that what God has revealed about himself in the Bible is true and that following him is worth it. And that's why I've titled this entire series, Jesus is Better. He's best. Faith is believing that Jesus is better than anything else that you could possess in this life. All of those things that you guys mentioned are wonderful things. But Jesus is better than any of them. And the author of Hebrews says that without faith, you'll never please God because you'll never go all the way with Jesus. You'll never fully commit yourself to the mission. You won't obey him in the hard areas. You'll never make it through the dark chapters in your life if you don't have faith. I like to say that you'll never consistently choose God's ways until you believe that his ways are best. And I think that's true, especially when the difficult seasons in your life come. If you don't believe that God's ways are best, you won't choose to walk in them. You got to remember that the people to whom the author of Hebrews is writing to, they're struggling because the Christian life has gotten very hard for them. They're being persecuted. They have difficult questions. They have unanswered prayers. Some of them are barely hanging on. And so here in chapter 12, the author is going to offer them four helps to faith. Four helps to faith. So if you're taking notes, you can jot that down tonight. Four helps to faith, specifically helps in difficult times. And I want you to look at how he sets it up. We kind of jumped into this last week and took a peek into verse 1 of chapter 12, but I want to look at it again. He says, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Now, I think this is an illustration that we can all kind of identify with right now, especially. We just kind of came off of, I think it was about a month ago that the Olympics ended, right? How many of you spent some time this summer watching the Summer Olympics? Any of you? Handful, all right. Some of you a little bit. I got into it a little bit more this year than I have in the past, probably to my own detriment, like breakdancing and rhythmic gymnastics or ribbon dancing, whatever it's called. I mean, who said that's a sport, right? I mean, handball, I think they're starting to make up new sports, aren't they, to just include in the Olympics. But anyway, I watched way more than I have in the past this year, and paid attention to the clips coming through. The author of Hebrews, though, here in verse 1, he says that the Christian life is like a marathon. So he says, run the race set before us with endurance. That word race is the word agon. It's the word we get agony from, which if any of you are like me, and sorry, Vaughn, our cross-country coach in the room, running is agony, right? Anybody with me on that? I hate to run. I've always hated to run. And conditioning in every sport I played was my least favorite part. So I get it, right? The race is agony. It literally comes from that word. So there's biblical grounds for that, Vaughn. Running is agony. But that's the word used here, agon. It's the word agony. And it was a word that they used in their day to refer to the pentathlon. And that might have been what the author of Hebrews kind of had in mind when he said, let's run with endurance this race set before us. He maybe had even that pentathlon in his mind. The pentathlon was a 5-event sporting match that ended with a Greco-Roman boxing match. So I want you to kind of imagine this, right? After you ran and after you swam, you would square off with one another in the ring. It's kind of a cool event, actually. The fighters would wear these leather gloves that would protect their hands but disfigure the other person's face. It was an agonizing event. That's where the word came from. It was an agonizing event. So you just kind of imagine it for a moment at the end of the men's 100-meter, kind of would have liked to have seen that, right? Noah Lyles goes over and just brawls with that Jamaican guy. I mean, they run the race and then they just start duking it out. That's the kind of event that this pentathlon was. And the point, though, whether he was referring to that event or not, the point that he's getting at with using this word is that the Christian life is hard, and at times it can be agonizing. It's a marathon. And for many of us that are in the room, this is right where you are. You're in a season of life that is difficult. The chapter that you've come to in your story is a difficult chapter. And for many of us, we kind of thought the Christian life was supposed to be all warm fuzzies and abundant life. And you might be in a season where you're like, that's not what I'm feeling right now. This is not what I'm experiencing. And I think the author of Hebrews is writing to a group of Christians that are in a very similar situation. And so he comes to them here in chapter 12, and he's going to give them some helps for their faith. He's going to say, here are some things that you need to remember, that you need to hold on to. And so if you're taking notes, write these down, because whether you're in that season right now or that season is still to come for you, these can be some things that you can hold on to, that you can look back at, that can bring strength to your faith when you're in a time of need. The first one here is consider the witnesses. He says, consider the witnesses. The first word in chapter 12, verse 1, is the word therefore. And I've heard a lot of sermons in my day. Okay, I grew up in church. You guys know I make the joke I was a drug baby because I was drugged to church every single Sunday and Wednesday and many times Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday as well. My dad's a minister, has been my entire life. So I grew up in the church. I've heard a lot of sermons. And every pastor I've ever heard always makes this joke. When he sees the word therefore, he always acts like he's the one who made up the joke, but he's not. He says, anytime you see the word therefore, you ought to what? Always look and see what it's there for. It points you backwards, which is not really a funny joke because we've all heard it way too many times, but it is true. That's what the word is there for. It's to point you back to what has just been said. So what has just been said? Well, he's pointing you back to the list of heroes of the faith in Hebrews chapter 11. He points to all of these people who risked it all on God and his promises. And he says, because of all of these men and women and heroes of the faith that have gone before you, because of them, he summarizes the list in chapter 11, verse 32. He says, through faith, some of them quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. And then he says, others, however, suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword, which means that some of them, through faith, saw God do incredibly powerful, miraculous things. Which is, we're all like, that's the story I want, right? But he says others died without ever receiving an earthly validation for their faith. And I want you to notice this. These people, right? You have some who saw God intervene in time and space and do what only God can do, and you had others who never saw it this side of eternity. And I want you to not miss this. They both prayed the same prayers, right? They both had the same kind of faith. He's honoring them here in the Hall of Faith. So sometimes I think it's easy for us in our life to look at someone else who God answers their prayer the way that they asked for in this life. And then here we are, and we're exercising faith, and we're walking with him, and we're praying the same prayer, and yet God's not answering it here and now. And we begin to kind of question, well, what's the deal? What's going on here? You know, I think a wonderful example of this, and I know we talk about Trey, and Jeremy shared some of Trey's story on Sunday, was the anniversary, September 1st, 11 years since Trey Freeman's passing. I know we talk about that a lot, but I think it's a great picture in one family. And this is true for me. I had the great honor and privilege, as many of you did, of walking with their family 13 years ago, or 11 years ago, 12 years ago when Trey got sick. And I prayed the same prayers for Trey that I prayed for Caleb. God answered one in eternity, and he answered one here on this earth. Well, was there anything different in our prayers or in the Freeman's faith or prayers? No, same prayers, praying for healing, praying for God to intervene, praying for God to do what only he can do. And in one situation, he answered here and now, and in one situation, he answered in eternity. And that's life, right? We've all experienced that to some extent. But here's what I think you need to remember. If you require earthly validation of your faith, you're not going to endure. You won't make it. And I really need us to think about that tonight. These were people in Hebrews chapter 11 just like you and just like me. We kind of put them up on a pedestal. We tend to read these stories and we think these were incredible men and women of faith and they had everything figured out. No, they had doubts. They had questions that weren't answered. You guys have read your Bibles. I mentioned Job last week. Job in the Old Testament was one of the 3 greatest men of faith that ever lived. And he ends the book basically saying, God, this makes no sense to me. I don't understand. Why are you doing what you're doing? Why have you allowed this incredible loss to take place in my life? And God's answer to Job is basically this. Excuse me, Job. Until you create your own universe from scratch, you're probably not in a place to question me. If you're still stumped by quantum physics, don't suspect that you can master the internal workings of my infinite mind. That's my paraphrase, but that's basically what God says to Job. Job died without ever really understanding what God had been up to on the earth. What God did give him a glimpse of was his steadfast love and his infinite power. Job got revelation from God, but not explanation. And that's what we get often. Our experience, says the church father Anselm, is faith-seeking understanding. We want to understand, and God gives us flashes of understanding sometimes, but even the best and smartest of us have unanswered questions. And so these Old Testament saints, they're like the people who started the marathon before us. And this is one of the things, Vaughn, that I love about cross country, right? All the runners that finish the race early, so I don't know if it's the varsity that runs first or the JV, I can't remember, but the ones who run first and finish the race first, you know what they do after they finish running, for the most part? They come back and they line up the sides, especially along the finish line, and they cheer the rest of the runners on until they finish. That's what I love it about cross country. Only sport that you see that. Other teams even cheering on other teams to go and to finish. Well, what the author of Hebrews is saying is that these Old Testament brothers and sisters in Christ, saints, They're the ones who started the marathon long before us, and now they're cheering us on from the sidelines as we continue to run, saying, keep going. It's worth it. You're going to make it. You may not see it answered here and now, but you'll see it answered in eternity. They stand there saying, it may not make sense to you now. This race is agonizing and it's painful and it's difficult, but don't quit. It didn't make sense to us either. But you can see now that in all of our trials, God was working even when we didn't understand, bringing something out of us far beyond what we could see. He was bringing Christ to earth through us. We couldn't see it, but now you can see it. They're saying we stand as witnesses to you that God is working in your pain now, just like he was in ours, bringing to pass a greater plan than you realize. So he says, here's what helps your faith. Consider the witnesses. And I would just encourage you that I think this is true, not just of looking at the Bible. I think that's a big part of it, and the Old Testament witnesses, and now for us, even the New Testament witnesses. But I think this is true. This is true today. Brothers and sisters that we know who have gone before us, some of them may even still be living, but they've walked the path ahead of us, and we've watched them as they've faced difficulty and suffering and trials. And their testimony, their witness is an encouragement to us. It strengthens our faith because we say, oh man, if they can do it and they can get through, so can I. Could be brothers and sisters that have already gone to be with the Lord that we've known, maybe parents, grandparents, people that have invested in us in years past that are the witnesses. Think back on those people. I told you, I think it was last week, I love reading biographies of not just biblical heroes, but heroes throughout history, especially heroes of the faith, missionaries. They're encouragements to me when times get difficult, when I'm in a place of struggle or darkness in my own life, and I see them walk through that in theirs and how they dealt with it and looked to the Lord and his promises. It's an encouragement to my faith. Encourages me to keep going. So consider the witnesses. That's the first thing. The second thing to help our faith, the second help to our faith, he says, fix your eyes on Jesus. And now this is a repetitive theme in the book of Hebrews. Fix your eyes on Jesus. Really repetitive theme of the New Testament and really the entire Bible. But I want you to see this. Look at verse 2. He says, looking to Jesus. Looking to Jesus. In the Greek, that word looking or look, it's actually the word to look away. And don't misunderstand that. Not to, oh, you were looking at him and now you look somewhere else, but to look away in the future or at a great distance. As to look off into the distance. So what he's saying is look to Jesus, not just what you think or see him doing right now, but look outside of your pain and look outside of the darkness around you, specifically looking to two things about him. I want you to see these in the text. He says, looking to Jesus, the founder and the perfecter of our faith. So the first one is this. Some of your translations, instead of perfecter, it might say the completer of our faith. The first thing that you're looking to out of your pain, out of your darkness, out of your struggle and your trial, the first thing you're looking to about Jesus is his promise. You look to his promise. He's the author and the completer, the finisher, the perfecter. Jesus is the one who started this process in your life, and he's the one who will finish it. He'll complete it. The cross of Christ shows us just how much Jesus has invested in us. I want you to think about that statement for a minute. The cross of Jesus shows us just how much he has invested in us. Any of you guys ever sold a piece of property or a home before? Okay, most of us in the room. When you go through that process, one of the things that you have the buyer do, or if you've bought a piece of property or a home, is you put down something called earnest money. Anybody ever done that before? You know what earnest money is, right? Earnest money is, and they set that amount to be just, not too much, but just enough that you're not going to walk away from the deal for some trivial reason. because you don't want to lose that earnest money, right? It's an investment to say, I'm serious about purchasing this home or this piece of property, or if you're selling it for the buyer, you're wanting them to say, I'm serious enough that I'll put X amount of money down as earnest money, because you're not going to just walk away from it for a trivial reason. Well, in many ways, that's what I'm saying, and that's what the author of Hebrews is saying about Jesus. He has invested in you. He's begun this work in you. He's going to finish it. Think about what he's invested. He has invested his blood into you. He's got more invested into you than you do, and he will complete the process. He is the author of your faith, but he is also the perfecter, the completer, the finisher of your faith. He begun the process, and he did it by investing his own blood, his own life, to begin that process. And because he has begun it, he is going to finish it. So when you give up on yourself, God won't. The cross shows you how committed he is to seeing it through. And by the way, I don't know about you, this takes the pressure off of me. Like as a pastor, but just as a follower of Jesus. What sermon am I going to preach this next Wednesday or this next Sunday? It's going to change people's lives. Hey, it's not me. He's the beginner. He's the author. And he's the finisher. He's the one who completes it. I want to bring a home run every single time I preach, but that's not where the power is. It's Jesus, the author and the completer, the finisher of your faith. This takes the pressure off of you. How am I going to change my life? You don't have to. He's the founder and the finisher. In a sense, you're being asked to run a race that has already been won. So, of course you can get up. He's already provided the assurance of victory and all of the power to get there. You know, when we first come to Christ, when we're saved, you know, we use terms like I accepted Jesus, or I asked Jesus to be the boss of my life, or I professed faith. We have all these different sayings. I was born again, all of these different sayings to describe when we begin our journey walking with Jesus. And when you begin walking with Jesus, it seems like you're making all of the decisions. But what the Bible is teaching here is it really wasn't your idea. Jesus was the author. I want you to listen to what Charles Spurgeon says. He says, "Listen to the voice of the Lord speak. I will help you. It is a small thing for me, your God, to help you. Consider what I've already done." What? Not help you? I bought you with my blood. What? Not help you? I died for you. Since I have done the greater, will I not do the less? God, who is infinite in power, who brought Jesus' dead, lifeless body back from the grave, is at work in you, and he can bring your life back from the ashes. So he says, you need to look to Jesus. You need to look to his promise. The second thing you need to look to is his experience. Look at what it says in verse 3. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. The second thing you need to look to about Jesus, not just his promise, but also his experience. Consider the hostility against him. You know, sometimes I give too much of an ear to the critics of our faith, to the critics of Christianity. You know, they say things like, we're ignorant because we believe that a personal, intelligent God created and rules the world. There's a famous atheist named Christopher Hitchens that says he thinks religion should be treated with ridicule, hatred, and contempt. Another, Sam Harris, says that the problem with Christianity is that it allows believers in mass what only idiots or lunatics could believe in isolation. Richard Dawkins, another famous atheist, says that we are guilty as Christians of child abuse, that what we teach our children is worse than sexual abuse, and we ought to have our children taken away from us. Or I'll read an editorial in the New York Times or on some blog that says that we're hateful people because we believe what God says about right and wrong. And often when I give too much of an ear to the critics, I'm reminded of Jesus' words in John 16. He says, they hated me, they'll hate you too. In fact, you should be wary when all men speak well of you. You know, Jesus' crucifixion was a group project between the government officials, Pilate, the religious authorities, the Pharisees, the educated elite, the Sadducees, and the mainstream media, a combo of all of the above. In his day, it was the political right and the political left. And what Jesus is saying is, if they treated me this way, you should expect the same kind of treatment if you really follow me. In fact, in John 16, he says, and be careful here because I'm not trying to say we go looking for hatred or looking for a fight, but he says, be wary when all men speak well of you. He says it's when you're not getting the reaction that Jesus got, that's when you should be concerned. When everybody speaks well of you, if you don't get any kind of criticism or critique, if there's no persecution at all, ever, that's when you should be wary. Maybe you're not really following the Jesus of the Bible. Verse 4, he says, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. He says, at least you haven't died yet, so be encouraged. They killed me, they crucified me. The author says, look away to Jesus. The cross shows you that he is committed to seeing this thing through. The resurrection shows you that he is able to see it through. The cross shows you that the pain you're experiencing now is to be expected, but don't lose heart. God only brings the power of the resurrection through the pain of the cross. So I know I'm speaking to some people in here tonight that you might be on the brink of giving up. Don't do it. He's already won the race. You just need to get up and let him finish his run through you. Look to him. Look outside, away from your pain, your struggle, and look to Jesus, his promise, and his own personal experience. Third help to faith. Look at verse 5. Third help to faith. He says, and have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. Now, jump down, look at verse 11. He says, for the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. This is your third help. First one was consider the witnesses. Second one was look to Jesus. Third is trust the fatherly sovereignty of God. Trust the fatherly sovereignty of God. There are actually two metaphors at work in these verses. The first metaphor is that of a coach. For those of you who've ever played sports, you'll get this one. For those who didn't, maybe you'll get the next one. He says trained. Look at verse 11. He says, for the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. See that word trained there? That is the word gymnazo. Okay, it's the word we get gymnasium from, right? Gymnasium. And so what he's referring to here is this idea of athletic training that would take place in a gym. So there's a sense in which God is working in your life like a coach works. The way you grow muscle, all right, if you've ever worked out in your life, the way you grow your muscle is by what? Breaking it down, right? You break it down, and after it's broken down, your body rebuilds it stronger than it was before. So here's the thing. When you're being worked out, you don't feel stronger, right? I don't feel like I'm getting stronger. I feel like I'm going to die when I'm working out. But you are getting stronger because that muscle breaks down, and then as it heals, your body produces more of it, and it gets stronger and stronger. I kind of staying on the Olympics. Years ago, I saw a special on Michael Phelps. You remember the great Olympic swimmer, won so many medals. And the story goes that one of the things his coach would do to help prepare him for the race is very unconventional things. He would prepare him for difficulty. And so one of the things that he did was he would step on Michael's goggles and break them, crack them, so that water would get into his eyes and he couldn't see as well underwater, because he was trying to prepare him in practice for, one, the unknowns that would arise, but also to continue to perform in the face of adversity. So that was part of the way that he would train Phelps to perform even if things didn't exactly go according to his plan. And I think there's a lesson there for us. Just because God's plan isn't our plan does not mean it's not a good plan. I don't think Phelps ever planned on his coach intentionally breaking his goggles before he got in the pool. But God is a good coach who is at work in all things, working for our good, molding us into Christ's image. And so some of us need to hear the pain in your life right now, the pain that you're going through, is God's good plan in your life to mold you into his image and to increase your faith and your delight in him. He's tearing you down in your strength so he can rebuild you up in his. Which leads me to the second metaphor he uses in these verses, and that's of a father. It's one of a father. Look back at verse 5. He says, "Have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord." The word used for discipline here is a different one than the one used in verse 11. It's the word paideia, which is where we get our word podiatry from, or maybe you're familiar with pediatrician. It has to do with how a good father disciplines a child. A good parent disciplines his child for wrongdoing, not to pay them back for their wrongdoing, but what? To form their character, right? To correct. Just as a pediatrician would diagnose and treat and correct for your health, not to punish you, but to bring health into your life, so too God disciplines us in this way, not to avenge the wrong that we did. It's not, you're going to pay for having spilled that milk. At least it's not supposed to be like that. Sometimes in my house it is. But as a parent, what? You know, right? You're supposed to discipline your children in order to mold their character. What you're doing for them, you're doing in love. Your goal is the building up of character. So the author goes on and says in verses 8, 9, and 10 that no parent disciplines perfectly. Sometimes we are more angered about how the child has inconvenienced us than we are concerned with their character, right? That's not the right way, but that's what happens sometimes as parents. We're more inconvenienced and frustrated with that than we are concerned with them being the people God wants them to be. But God is not an imperfect parent. That's what he's saying here. God is a perfect father, and so his anger toward his children is never the anger of justice, it's the discipline of love. Because listen, the gospel message is this: God paid Jesus back 100% for your sin and for my sin. If you're a Christian here tonight, every single ounce of punishment for sin was put on Jesus. And for God to give 1 ounce of that punishment to you for your sin, now that he's put it on Jesus, would actually be unjust, because God would be demanding 2 punishments for the same sin. So let me give this to you in a real world example. If your husband or your wife pays the electric bill for your house, which has been through the roof in my house because of the heat these last few weeks, and the electric company calls you, the husband, and says, "Hey, you need to pay the electric bill for your house," and you knew that your wife had already paid it, you would say, "Wait a minute, that's not right. I don't have to pay for this bill twice. That's unfair. The bill's already been paid. You can't ask for 2 payments for the same bill. It's the same with God. The bill was paid for your sin on the cross. He put it on Christ. There's no condemnation for those who are in Christ because that full condemnation fell upon Jesus. So if you're a believer, God is never paying you back for your sin in the hardships of life. And I've been guilty of this at times. And I hear believers saying things like this. Well, man, I think God's just paying me back for that bad decision that I made. Or I think God's, man, I just messed up and he's just punishing me for this sin or this bad decision. And I know people that feel like they live under the curse of God for something they did years ago. And they continue to carry around that shame and that guilt and that hurt. And what I'm telling you is what the gospel says to you. Jesus absorbed all of the curse for you. He took all the judgment, all the punishment. Nothing is left for you but mercy. So in your pain and in your suffering and in your trial, he is not paying you back. He might be trying to bring you back, but that's different. He's not paying you back. And I want to just kind of distinguish, I think this is helpful. I want to distinguish three things that I think people get confused when we talk about this. Punishment or judgment, those are the same thing. Punishment and judgment, same thing. Discipline and consequences. Three different things. Three different things in the Bible. Punishment or judgment is you're being paid back for the wrong you've done. The code of justice has been broken and you must pay. So punishment and judgment for you, if you're in Christ, was paid for on the cross. It was already paid for. It's not coming for you. It's already been taken care of. There is no punishment or judgment. There is no condemnation for those who are in Christ. Discipline does come to you as a child of God. That's what the author of Hebrews is talking about here in chapter 12. Discipline is a loving attempt to mold your character. And yes, sometimes discipline is painful. It can involve pain, but the goal is not retribution, it is formation. God is seeking to form you, to mold you into the likeness of Christ. So you got judgment, punishment. For those who are in Christ, that was taken by Christ on the cross. Then you have discipline, God's intervention in your life to mold your character more into Christ's likeness. And then third, you have consequences. Consequences are natural results that you face because of bad decisions. So you have sex outside of the marriage bed and the girl gets pregnant. That's not punishment per se, it's biology. It's a natural consequence for your action. You cheat on your spouse and the trust in your marriage is destroyed. It's broken. It's a consequence of your action. You're self-absorbed as a father and your kids end up estranged, walking away from you. That's a consequence. You cheat and you get kicked out of school. That's a consequence. You do sloppy work at your job and you get fired. That's a consequence. Those are natural consequences. Now, let me be clear. God can use natural consequences as discipline in your life. But technically, you should think of them differently. So punishment, discipline, and consequences. Believers suffer consequences for their sin, and sometimes God uses those consequences to discipline them. But they never suffer punishment because Jesus was punished fully in our place, so that all that is left for us is mercy. God is molding your character in love, not in punishment or in judgment. There's an author, he actually works at Midwestern Seminary, Baptist Theological Seminary now, used to pastor out in the East. He wrote a book called Gospel Wakefulness. His name's Jared Wilson. And he tells a story in this book about a friend of his who made some disastrous decisions that basically destroyed his entire family. And this guy talked about how the bitter consequences, the natural consequences for his decisions, for his sin, was his relationships were damaged. Some of them permanently damaged. Trust was irrevocably destroyed. But he said that suffering those natural consequences, as painful as it was, reminded him, and get this, reminded him that the ultimate consequence for his sin had been absorbed by Jesus. So experiencing the natural consequences of our sin can actually become a means of us relishing the grace of God towards us in that he took the ultimate punishment on the cross. So for the believer, you have to understand this. God is committed to growing you up in him. And yes, a lot of times he'll use pain and even disappointment in your life to do it. Some of us tend to think or would like to think that God is only a precious moments God, right? Any of you guys used to collect those? Some of you might have them at your house, the little figurines. And you kind of think, oh, God just is he's gonna protect me, and he's gonna coddle me, and he's always gonna give me warm fuzzies. He's a celestial piñata that you can whack with the faith stick and get goodies out of, right? I mean, that's kind of how you think about him. So your natural tendency is to get angry at him when things aren't going your way, or you think he's forgotten you, or you quit believing in him. But what happens, the author of Hebrews says, is that God's love is a fatherly love. It's a tough love. It's a love that forges our character and grows us up into maturity. I've heard it said, and I've seen this, it's not true across the board, but said that there's a difference in the way that mothers and fathers show their affection and their love. I've seen this in my home. This is an oversimplification, okay, so it's not true for everybody, but it says that often moms show their love to their children by pulling their kids close, bringing them in close. And fathers show their affection by pushing their kids out. And all the dads are like, amen, right? Want them out of the house, fully grown and doing their own thing. And moms want to keep them as long as they can. But that's kind of an oversimplification, but I've seen this, right? My kids get hurt. What does Jenna do? Well, Jenna's all over them, pulling them in, comforting them. In the pool, I'm showing my love for my kids by throwing them as far as I can, right? And if they hit the side, that's all right, right? That builds character, toughens them up. Okay, jump to me, right? Swim to me. And again, we both love our children. We show it a little bit differently. One shows the love by tenderness in pain, coming to them, drawing them in close. The other shows love by creating situations to grow them up and allow them to go and learn things on their own. Jenna comforts them when they're hurt. I create situations in which they hurt themselves, right? I mean, that's the difference in the way we love them. That's our team approach to parenting. But both of those are love. And by the way, God does both of those things. He is tender, and there is a time when he draws us in close. And he shows that affection by comforting us, but he's also tough. And there are times when he disciplines us as a son or a daughter. And the question for us is, do we trust in all things that God is disciplining us as a child of his? That our all-knowing, all-powerful God is in control of all things, and he's using them for our good. The writer says this is important in developing faith because it means that everything, every situation, difficult or not, every frustration, every inconvenience, every disappointment, every broken heart, every tragedy, God is at work in those things, forging your character. Let me show you just one thing in the text that I was going to cut for sake of time, but I think it's just too good to pass up. Look at verse 5 again. He says, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord. Don't take lightly God's discipline. That word there in verse 5, it's actually the exact same word translated despise in verse 2, where it says Jesus despised or took lightly the shame of the cross. You see that in verse 2? Despising the shame. Same exact word. In verse 5, he says, don't take lightly. In verse 2, he says, Jesus despising the shame. Same exact word. And I want you to see this. On the cross, Jesus took lightly the pain and the scorn of others. He took it lightly. He despised it. We're told not to despise or take lightly the discipline of God. But here's what I want you to notice. How often do we usually reverse those two things? We despise the pain in our life, but we put value on the opinions of others. Do you see it? We despise the struggle, the trial, the discomfort, the difficulty. But then we highly value what others say. God is saying here in Hebrews, we should put value on the Lord's discipline. And we should take lightly the opinion of others. And the reason that we have a tendency to get this reversed the wrong way is because we don't esteem what God esteems, which is the growth of our faith. The author of Hebrews is saying there is nothing on earth more valuable than your faith. No greater gift that God could give to you than faith. So sometimes God will take away things of lesser value to work in you the thing of greatest value, which is faith. That's what he's telling us. Fourth thing to help us with our faith, and I skipped over this in verse 2 intentionally because I wanted to come back and end with it, is to focus on the joy. Focus on the joy. Look at what he says in verse 2. He says, looking to Jesus, the founder and the perfecter of our faith, look at this phrase, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. What was it that held Jesus to the cross? What was it that held him there? It was the joy. That's what the author of Hebrews is saying. This is the man that raised the dead, calmed the storms, walked through walls. It wasn't those physical nails that held him to the cross. That didn't have power over him. What held him to the cross, according to verse 2, was the joy that waited for him on the other side. The joy of what? Well, think about it. What joy would he obtain after the cross that he wouldn't have had before it? The approval of God? No, he already had that. When he was baptized, God said, "This is my son in whom I'm well pleased." It was us, right? It wasn't that he was going to become king of the universe. He already had that. It wasn't the adoration of angels. He had that from eternity past. The one thing that he would have after the cross that he didn't have before was you and me, his children. He was doing this to save us. We were his inheritance. For the joy of reconciling you and me to himself, he endured the cross. If Christ felt that way about you, doesn't that make you long to see him? So the author says, look to Jesus and look to his joy. If this is the God who gave it all up to save you, doesn't that empower you to give up what you have for him? Doesn't that make you willing to suffer for his sake? I've shared this quote before. It changed my life studying Philippians chapter 2, but it's a similar concept that's here in Hebrews 12. C.T. Studd, great missionary, part of a group called the Cambridge Seven, left England and Cambridge and his studies, and he came from a wealthy family, famous athlete that played cricket, played in one of the most famous cricket games in the 1800s, left all of that to go to India on the mission field. And he said this, if Jesus Christ be God and gave his life for me, there is no sacrifice too great for me to give for him. When you understand that what held Jesus to the cross was the joy of saving you, doesn't that change everything? Doesn't it change everything? If Christ gave himself up so that I could be saved, doesn't that make me willing to give up whatever I have for him? Whatever I have for others to be saved? When you were lost, Jesus made your rescue his joy. If that is true, can't you make the rescue of others who are in the same condition you were in before Jesus rescued you? Can't you make that your joy? People of faith are joy-driven. Yes, the biggest difference between religious people and people who are transformed by the gospel. Religious are duty-driven. You dread what I say each week because you're going, man, what's he going to make me feel guilty about this Wednesday? That's religious. It's duty-driven. People who are transformed by the gospel are driven by the joy of knowing and pleasing the one who gave up everything to save them, and the joy of rescuing others just like they were rescued. So I've thought about this, right? Because one of our jobs as leaders in the church is to help people get this joy, right? Like one, for believers to understand it, but also for people who are far from Christ to come to him and to be rescued and to recognize and realize this. And there's been times in my life that I struggled, like even this building, right? There's times that I've struggled, like, man, how do you ask people to give their hard-earned money to help build a building like this, or to give to the church to help continue ministries? But you know what I come back to? Why is it that someone should give up their possessions or their time or their lives for kingdom work? Why? It's not because you've taken a vow of poverty and you don't enjoy nice things. It's not why. It's the joy of what you'll obtain by giving those things away for a greater joy. It's not that, I enjoy a stack of cash as much as the next person, right? You can do a lot of things with that. I enjoy nice things. I enjoy those things. It's not that you don't enjoy those things. It's that you're willing to part with those things because there's a greater joy. There's something better. A great definition of sacrifice is this: giving up something you love for something you love even more. I love that definition of sacrifice. Every penny that I have ever given away, I can honestly say, maybe not initially was my heart always in the right place, but once I had given it, I've loved that I've been able to give it. Yeah, I might have grieved a little bit letting go of certain things that I wanted in life, but at the end of the day, I get greater joy from pleasing Jesus and seeing people come into the kingdom. That's what brings me greater joy. That's what led Jesus to sacrifice so much, which is what makes verse 1 so powerful to me. He says, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. This idea of sin and weights, just really quick. The Christian life and experience is not simply, what do I have to give up because it is sin, but what keeps me from knowing and pleasing Jesus. Yes, we give up our sin, but he also says the weight. What keeps me from rescuing the lost? What dilutes my life from the mission? You got to think of it like a runner or a swimmer who lays aside everything that slows him down. So it's not just sin, it's also the things that would slow us down from living out the life that God has called us to, living for the mission of advancing the kingdom. What does a swimmer or a runner do? They lay everything aside. They get rid of body fat, they cut weight. A lot of them shave their heads, or at least they wear the cap to reduce the weight of their hair or the friction in the water or the air. They even put on undecent clothing, right? They lose all their clothes, right? Get down to the least amount so it won't weigh them down. It's not illegal to swim in the Olympics with a full beard and a pair of jeans. It's not. But it's just not helpful for the objective, right? To run or swim as fast as you can. So the Christian life is not just to put away the sin, but also the things that would weigh you down and keep you from pursuing and completing the mission that Jesus has given. People of faith are those who are consumed by the vision of eternity, and so they gladly give up their lives here for the joy that they will obtain there. Faith is living in a way now that 100 years from now, you'll be glad you did. That's faith. That's faith. So I want to just kind of in closing, and I've gone a little bit long tonight, but that's okay. I want to just ask you this question. Is your life the kind that you would say, if there is no God and these promises are not true, none of this is worth it? Let me ask that again. Is your life the kind that you would say, if there is no God and these promises are not true, none of this is worth it? If not, I don't think you're walking by faith, and I don't think your life is pleasing to God. It's faith that gives you the ability to lay it all on the line. to obey even when it doesn't make sense, to forgive someone who has hurt you, to get back up after you fall, to pray when things seem hopeless, to hope even in the dark chapters of your story? Have you laid it all on the line saying, I do believe there is a God, and I do believe all of his promises are true, and I'm going to live my life no matter what?